King Charles confidently walked into the secure royal vault, fully expecting a quiet, mundane morning of processing routine estate paperwork, and instead shockingly found out that his late mother had been actively running an entire, massive financial operation completely behind his back for years. The heavy document patiently waiting for him absolutely wasn't some standard, boring estate filing. It was an ironclad legal instrument, explicitly signed by Queen Elizabeth II herself, that permanently placed a massive, highly private reserve of royal wealth directly under the strict stewardship of Prince William, absolutely not the reigning monarch. And the absolute kicker, it had explicitly been in full legal effect since the exact day she died. Charles had been reigning king for almost 2 full years, completely blissfully unaware that his eldest son technically, legally controlled a massive protected fortune that Charles himself could absolutely never touch. So, that is exactly where it gets incredibly weird and highly revealing. Because the true explosive story isn't merely just that Elizabeth legally made this unusual arrangement, it's that she specifically, methodically built it entirely to keep Charles firmly locked out of it. She absolutely didn't accidentally forget to include him in the paperwork. She deliberately, surgically removed him from the entire financial equation. And when you sit down and actually critically look at exactly what was written versus exactly what happened, the whole complex arrangement starts to look significantly less like a traditional family inheritance, and vastly more like a quiet, devastating vote of absolute no confidence, neatly wrapped in impenetrable legal language. The nervous archivist placed the sealed black file directly on the table, respectfully using both hands exactly like it was a sacred, fragile object. Charles opened it entirely without ceremony, because massive stacks of documents reached his heavy desk daily, and he naturally assumed this specific one would follow the exact same boring administrative rhythm as absolutely everything else. His eyes abruptly stopped at the stark header before the very first paragraph even finished. Royal Vault Instrument, Private Family Reserve, Irrevocable. Twice, Charles read the following devastating sentence before finally looking away in shock. Prince William Arthur Philip Louis was explicitly named the sole future steward of a massive, heavily protected reserve of highly privately held royal family funds. That specific reserve stood entirely, legally, outside all public state financing. Elizabeth had meticulously built it completely from massive personal holdings quietly accumulated over decades, including vast private estates, immensely valuable inherited assets, and incredibly carefully managed generational family wealth that had absolutely never appeared in absolutely any public accounting of royal finances. Princess Anne stood silently at the far end of the quiet room. She had said absolutely nothing when they initially arrived. She said absolutely nothing now. Turning slowly to the second page, Charles found exactly what the first page had only darkly suggested. The massive reserve absolutely wasn't just a simple trust fund casually set aside for a rainy day. It was a massively constructed, complex system complete with its own strict, unyielding rules. Specific properties legally connected to it absolutely could not ever be sold without prior, unanimous council approval. Massive liquid assets tied to it absolutely could not ever be redirected toward the reigning monarch's household for absolutely any purpose whatsoever. Elizabeth had brilliantly built an entire, massive financial architecture running deep beneath the highly visible structure of the crown, deliberately, permanently placed far beyond the reach of absolutely whoever happened to hold the title above it. Setting the heavy file down without closing it, the king tried desperately to process exactly what he had just read. He had spent the past grueling 2 years carefully guiding the monarchy through its difficult transition from public mourning to active governance. He had naturally, confidently assumed his mother's vast private affairs would simply, naturally, fold into the significantly broader holdings he now managed as sovereign. He had absolutely not imagined for a second that she had deliberately drawn a quiet, absolute boundary directly across a massive part of that estate right before drawing her final breath. William had arrived quietly with Anne and stood tensely at the opposite end of the long table. Absolutely no smug triumph showed on his face. There was absolutely only a highly complex look that sat uncomfortably somewhere exactly between shock and dread. He had absolutely not known what the black file contained when he walked through the heavy door that morning. An anxious estate trustee cleared his throat and formally confirmed exactly what both men were currently struggling to process. The royal vault instrument had been fully witnessed, heavily sealed, and completely, legally enforceable from the exact moment Elizabeth signed it. That specific binding document took absolute effect automatically in September 2022, the exact month she tragically died. William had therefore legally held the technical stewardship of those massive funds for almost 2 entire years, completely unaware of the massive reserve's existence. Charles looked up very slowly from the page. His single question for the terrified trustee was incredibly simple. Exactly how large is the reserve? The official paused significantly before finally answering. That heavy, terrified pause instantly told the king significantly more than absolutely any numerical figure eventually would. Anne moved quietly toward the absolute center of the table. She placed exactly one hand flat on the polished surface, directly between the two men, but crucially reached for absolutely neither the file nor her brother. She deliberately created a quiet, unshakable space directly between a king painfully absorbing a massive loss of power and a prince suddenly carrying a massive responsibility absolutely neither of them had prepared for. Absolute silence held the room, while Charles simply stared at his mother's famous signature resting on the final line. Queen Camilla had absolutely not been invited to this meeting. The trustees had explicitly not requested her presence. Elizabeth's famous name sat firmly at the base of that page, written in the small, incredibly careful script the king had instantly recognized his entire life. The specific, powerful name directly above hers, the exact one now carrying absolute legal authority over massive funds Charles had confidently assumed the throne would automatically control, was absolutely not his own. Before we go any further down this rabbit hole, if you are genuinely enjoying this deep dive into highly complex, behind-the-scenes royal drama, please hit that subscribe button for our channel so you absolutely don't miss future explosive updates. So, what exactly did the dense legal document actually mean in practice? Charles firmly asked the trustee to exhaustively explain absolutely every single clause before allowing him to move to the next page. The official absolutely did not rush the process. Opening a thick companion document, he nervously read absolutely each provision aloud to the room. A private royal reserve legally defines money and property that exclusively belongs to the royal family personally rather than to the British state. It absolutely does not ever appear in any public government budgets, and British taxpayers absolutely do not fund a single penny of it. Elizabeth had meticulously built this massive fund over the long course of her historic reign through incredibly careful, shrewd management of massive personal assets, forcefully retaining absolute, full authority to strictly direct its future use. Irrevocable was the single, terrifying word that mattered absolutely most inside the vault instrument. Once it legally took effect, absolutely no reigning sovereign and absolutely no reigning monarch could ever legally cancel it or rewrite it through their own personal, executive authority alone. The specific ironclad clause completely preventing sovereign discretion was incredibly specific and highly deliberate. It explicitly stated that the currently reigning monarch absolutely could not ever redirect, legally dissolve, or aggressively reclaim the massive reserve. Not Charles, and absolutely not any king or queen who ever followed him on the throne. Anne listened intently, with her hands calmly folded directly in front of her. William read silently from a second, identical copy the trustee had nervously placed before him. Listed incredibly carefully was absolutely everything the massive fund could legally do. It could easily secure highly historic, vulnerable royal properties against severe financial pressure or future, desperate sale. It could heavily support the massive preparation and funding of the next generation of working royals. It could also explicitly protect the direct, immediate line of succession during highly volatile moments when public, taxpayer royal budgets simply could not safely absorb the massive operational cost. That highly specific phrase, the direct line of succession, legally refers exclusively to the clearest, most direct path from the current sovereign directly to those immediately positioned to follow. Equally specific, however, were its incredibly strict limitations. Absolutely no household member could ever casually withdraw from it for mere personal benefit or luxury. Absolutely no individual could ever unilaterally approve a massive payment without strict, independent oversight. Absolutely no amount of money could ever reach the king's own household in a form remotely resembling a slush fund or discretionary spending. William slowly placed his copy directly on the table and simply looked at the blank wall for a long moment. Absolutely each and every restriction landed incredibly clearly, requiring absolutely no further legal explanation. This was absolutely not a careless oversight in his aging grandmother's estate planning. She absolutely had not simply forgotten to include Charles. She had deliberately, surgically removed him completely from the financial equation. The trustee continued reading. A completely separate, highly powerful body legally called the Private Continuity Council would actively, independently manage the massive fund. William legally held the impressive stewardship title, which carried immense, heavy responsibility, but incredibly little actual unilateral freedom. Absolutely every single meaningful financial decision strictly required the formal, majority agreement of a highly specific council Elizabeth had established entirely separately. Its specific members, their highly individual roles, and the incredibly specific strict conditions under which they could legally act were all securely sealed inside a second heavy file, absolutely not yet open. Turning sharply to Anne, the furious king had exactly one direct question for his sister. He pointedly asked whether she had intimately known about the existence of this secret council before today. She calmly met his furious gaze and honestly answered that she had been entirely aware of the massive reserve since the very day the instrument was originally drafted. The full, complex structure of the body, she clarified, had absolutely not been explicitly shown to her until the exact day she was formally asked to legally sign it. Looking back down at the devastating document, the king deeply understood exactly what it truly told him. His mother had brilliantly, ruthlessly built something explicitly designed to fiercely protect a massive institution directly from absolutely everyone she loved most in the world. The cold, unyielding discipline of that massive decision was absolutely unmistakable. The deep personal pain of it was equally, devastatingly clear. William quickly raised one hand before the second file could even be opened. He desperately wanted to know exactly why his grandmother had genuinely felt absolutely any of this drastic action was truly necessary. And that specific, painful answer absolutely did not begin in a stuffy, expensive lawyer's office. It absolutely did not begin during any formal routine review of royal finances or a cold legal conversation about complex inheritance law. It specifically began during Elizabeth's final, fading summer at Balmoral, her highly private Scottish residence, when a highly ambitious, handwritten proposal unexpectedly arrived directly on her desk right after dinner. Absolutely nothing about the massive request was technically illegal. It was incredibly carefully worded, yet it unsettled Elizabeth so deeply and profoundly that she urgently summoned Anne before midnight and fiercely ordered the highly sensitive papers immediately removed from her private study. Charles had confidently drafted the massive proposal himself long before he was actually king. He was actively, eagerly preparing for the massive reign ahead, and a massive part of that vital work involved actively planning exactly how the massive private family reserve would be aggressively managed once the heavy crown finally transferred to him. The lengthy document boldly outlined massively expanded residences, totally reorganized household staff, and a significantly stronger, massive financial foundation for exactly what it cheerfully described as the incoming sovereign's household. Elizabeth coldly read absolutely every single page entirely without speaking. When Charles confidently arrived the very following morning to excitedly explain his grand reasoning, she stopped him and asked him exactly one piercing question long before he could offer a single, justifying word in his own defense. She directly wanted to know exactly whether Camilla had actively helped shape the massive financial priorities listed in the proposal. He hesitated. The heavy, guilty hesitation lasted exactly long enough to become its own undeniable answer. He then reluctantly confirmed that the future queen consort had indeed eagerly discussed several massive financial priorities directly with his top advisors. Something deep in that specific admission went infinitely beyond the ambitious proposal itself. Elizabeth sharply heard an arrogant, terrifying assumption resting exactly at its core, that massive private family wealth, painstakingly built and fiercely protected over long generations, could easily, naturally be completely reshaped and drained specifically to suit the lavish preferences of absolutely whoever happened to come next to the throne. She abruptly, coldly ended the meeting completely before her raw reaction could possibly exceed her legendary discipline. Charles confidently left Balmoral that day, genuinely believing the complex conversation would naturally continue later. It absolutely would not. After he was finally gone, Elizabeth spoke candidly to Anne. Through a highly documented, verified account later securely placed with her top private secretary, she sadly said she deeply feared Charles had foolishly allowed his intense personal affection to completely, dangerously blur an incredibly important, vital line between strict institutional duty and massive household ambition. She absolutely did not say it in hot, vindictive anger. She said it with the profound, quiet grief of someone who had desperately hoped right up until that exact moment to entirely avoid arriving at that painful, undeniable conclusion. By nightfall, Elizabeth had urgently summoned her most trusted private solicitor. Before issuing absolutely any final instructions to him, she thoughtfully returned to something highly specific William had told her during an earlier private visit to Balmoral. She had asked her grandson exactly one direct hypothetical question. What exactly would he fiercely protect first if massive royal finances were ever placed under serious, unprecedented strain? William had answered instantly, absolutely without pausing. He firmly said the next generation's secure future absolutely must never, ever be secured at the massive cost of destroying the institution they were actively preparing to inherit. Elizabeth absolutely did not tell him exactly what she intended to do with that specific telling answer. Retiring incredibly late that evening, she took a pen, drew a heavy, dark line completely through Charles's ambitious financial proposal, wrote exactly 4 devastating words directly in the margin, and securely sealed the doomed document permanently inside the black file. Those exact 4 words were absolutely not meant for future, polite alteration. Watching her mother decisively cross that heavy line, Anne instantly understood the massive decision would absolutely not ever be softened or reconsidered. Elizabeth was absolutely not pettily punishing her son. She was fiercely, desperately protecting something massive she genuinely believed he completely could not see clearly from exactly where he stood. The fine distinction, Anne deeply knew, would absolutely not make the brutal discovery absolutely any less painful for Charles when it finally, inevitably came. And it had finally come. Charles slowly closed the second file completely without reading the massive counsel section. He placed both hands heavily on the table and looked directly, piercingly at William. "Did you actually know she was doing this?" William replied incredibly firmly that he absolutely did not. His voice was perfectly steady, but his jaw was noticeably, visibly tight. Charles quickly, angrily accused William of actively, deliberately building an incredibly close, manipulative relationship with Elizabeth over the final years. He aggressively pointed out that William frequently visited her, extensively discussed the monarchy's future with her, and constantly presented himself to her as a highly steady, reliable presence during an incredibly difficult, scandalous time for the crown. Charles heavily suggested that these highly private conversations had inappropriately, heavily influenced his mother's massive final decisions in ways William quietly allowed completely, without ever being clear about his true intentions. William responded instantly, absolutely without hesitation. He firmly stated that she explicitly initiated absolutely every single highly private conversation with his grandmother. He absolutely never ever sought her out specifically to discuss massive finances or secret reserve arrangements. He absolutely did not request massive stewardship, a fancy new title, or deep secrecy. Absolutely none of that was his design or his desire. A terrified trustee tried desperately to speak and de-escalate, but Anne immediately raised a firm hand to stop him. Charles aggressively continued, loudly telling William that blindly accepting a massive arrangement that completely, legally excluded their father was absolutely not a neutral stance. He completely refused to accept that William had simply claimed the massive position and was just quietly benefiting from it without an agenda. William stood up incredibly forcefully and made it absolutely clear that he had absolutely not accepted anything yet. He firmly said he had merely been asked to review massive documents and had just found out his grandmother had placed something massive entirely in his name completely without warning. He had absolutely not chosen to be in that specific room or to have that incredibly difficult, toxic conversation. Anne stepped significantly closer to the table. She calmly told both men that Elizabeth had fully, entirely expected this exact, explosive confrontation, and had explicitly, specifically asked the Princess Royal to be there strictly as a neutral witness. She was absolutely not a neutral presence in the room. She had a highly specific, vital role. Whatever Charles currently felt towards his sister was absolutely no longer mere anger. It was significantly closer to a massive, fundamental betrayal he absolutely wasn't ready to process. Anne calmly said she would fully explain her specific role later. Before that happened, she firmly asked the king to open the second, sealed envelope waiting inside the black file. The specific envelope had his name written exactly by Elizabeth. A stark note clearly said to open it only if he aggressively challenged William's authority over the fund. He had already furiously done exactly that. Absolutely everyone in the quiet room watched intently as Charles slowly broke the heavy seal and read in absolute silence for a very long, agonizing moment. Then he slowly read a specific passage aloud to the room. Elizabeth wrote that she deeply, profoundly feared that strong emotional loyalties operating within the sovereign's household could easily, dangerously affect long-term, massive financial decisions and permanently weaken the institution for generations to come. She explicitly stated she was absolutely not questioning her son's intellectual ability to govern. She was deeply, profoundly concerned about the massive, toxic pressures surrounding him. Camilla's name was absolutely not written in the passage, but absolutely everyone in the room completely understood exactly who Elizabeth meant. Camilla was not included. Charles slowly set the heavy letter down and stayed completely silent for a full, agonizing minute. When he finally looked up at William, his fundamental question had entirely changed. He was absolutely no longer angrily asking if William secretly knew. He was agonizingly asking if his own mother had quietly, secretly doubted his ability from the very beginning, and if absolutely everything he did for decades to prepare for his reign was simply not enough for her. Slowly, the complex answer became clear. Elizabeth absolutely did not doubt her son's deep love for the crown. She was desperately trying to fiercely protect the crown from the massive burden of that specific love. The massive second file revealed something incredibly unexpected for both men. Elizabeth had absolutely not just slapped William's name on a massive fund and blindly trusted him to manage it alone. She had brilliantly, legally created a massive structure to fiercely protect the institution directly from absolutely everyone, explicitly including William himself. The trustee nervously introduced the complex document exactly as the Private Continuity Council record. A Continuity Council officially manages a highly protected asset exclusively during volatile changes in royal leadership. Elizabeth formed one featuring exactly 5 highly appointed members. Absolutely each member had specific massive authority over decisions directly related to the fund. Absolutely no single person, completely including William, could ever unilaterally approve a massive withdrawal, allocate massive assets, or radically change the reserve's direction entirely without a formal majority agreement. As William read the incredibly strict rules, he physically felt the massive, crushing weight of his brand new responsibilities. This was absolutely not just a massive fortune. It was a massive, highly restrictive role he simply could not easily escape, filled entirely with crushing obligations he absolutely hadn't chosen. Charles absorbed the massive structure completely without speaking. His brilliant mother had perfectly anticipated his immense anger and had explicitly included severe consequences for it directly in the document. The trustee nervously selected the very first guardian named, which instantly made Anne look down at her feet. Charles asked sharply if Anne already knew about the massive council when she agreed to join it. She calmly said she had explicitly signed up as the first guardian, exactly 3 days before Elizabeth passed away, genuinely thinking she could handle the immense emotional stress coming from both the current and future kings. Charles angrily questioned exactly why Anne hadn't told him immediately. She calmly reminded him of her solemn promise to Elizabeth, who had explicitly asked her to fiercely protect Charles from the immense emotional burden of the massive decision for as long as possible. The atmosphere in the room completely changed when the trustee suddenly named Catherine exactly as the council's designated moral safeguard. Catherine, completely not knowing exactly why she was even named there, slowly realized her massive job was to explicitly pause absolutely any massive decisions that could potentially harm the monarchy's long-term future. However, she absolutely did not have direct unilateral control over the financial matters themselves and had to focus entirely on fiercely supporting the monarchy's vital link to the very next generation. Camilla, standing defensively against the wall, instantly understood exactly what Catherine's elevated role explicitly meant, but she also instantly recognized she was absolutely, deliberately not part of the massive setup at all. William, with his eyes shut in absolute disbelief, quickly pointed out that Catherine currently looked significantly more scared than proud, clearly showing exactly how incredibly heavy the massive responsibility was for her. He read a specific statement from Elizabeth, explicitly explaining that she deliberately chose Catherine exactly because she could brilliantly, effortlessly keep highly personal feelings completely out of massively important decisions. This massive decision carried an incredibly loud, unspoken rejection, as it heavily highlighted Catherine's incredibly clear, elevated role while simultaneously, glaringly highlighting Camilla's total absence. Elizabeth absolutely never, ever shared this incredible story during her long lifetime, but it has absolutely now become a massive, permanent part of the monarchy's rigid structure. The fractured family left the massive vault that very afternoon completely without finding a neat solution. Charles went to a significantly smaller room and sat entirely alone. William stood heavily in a long hallway and absolutely did not talk to anyone. Catherine found a quiet spot by a large window, and Anne simply stayed by the table with her hands resting heavily on the closed, massive ledger. Heavy silence filled the entire evening, but it felt entirely different this time. Camilla finally approached Charles and desperately tried to reassure him that Elizabeth's massive arrangement absolutely did not lessen his massive position or ultimate authority as king. He listened quietly, then incredibly gently moved her comforting hand directly off his shoulder. He absolutely wasn't angry. He simply couldn't accept cheap comfort that clearly seemed to eagerly expect something massive in return. William eventually found Catherine resting in a side room. He vulnerably shared that inheriting absolutely everything massive felt exactly like taking on an impossible burden, just exactly as his aging father was actively struggling just to keep standing up. Accepting the massive inheritance meant flawlessly honoring his grandmother's strict wishes, while simply refusing it meant entirely giving up a massive protection she had incredibly carefully built. After midnight, William formally sent away absolutely all his hovering aides and walked heavily through the massive palace entirely alone. He eventually found Charles sitting in his private room, incredibly still wearing the exact same suit from earlier that long day. A simple glass of untouched water sat quietly nearby. There were absolutely no frantic trustees or highly paid lawyers present. For the very first time, both tired men spoke completely without their massive titles or crushing obligations. William softly told his father, Charles, that he would absolutely not take absolutely any personal benefits from the massive fund, and would absolutely not accept any direct, massive payments or lavish perks. He firmly suggested having totally independent, highly rigorous annual audits and solemnly promised Charles would absolutely always get full, transparent details on absolutely all massive fund decisions. William's incredibly generous offer effectively prevented Charles from ever claiming a massive victory. Charles simply said the money absolutely wasn't the main issue at all. It was Elizabeth's massive, obvious safeguards that heavily made him feel incredibly less important and deeply untrusted. William honestly admitted that he clearly saw his father's view of the future exactly as a massive threat, rather than a shared, unified responsibility. He carefully clarified that he absolutely didn't want to prematurely replace Charles, but desperately wanted to ensure their massive, mutual fears absolutely didn't permanently harm the crown's fragile future. The tired king finally signed a formal document, completely relinquishing his massive challenge, and William deliberately chose to sit quietly, exactly next to him, rather than antagonistically across the large table from him. Sensational news eventually spread incredibly quickly to the press about Elizabeth's massive decision to officially create a massive, protected fund with William firmly in charge. Aggressively challenging Charles's ultimate authority, the hungry media brutally portrayed him as being publicly, humiliatingly overruled, which made William incredibly uncomfortable. After attending a highly visible memorial together shortly after, Charles publicly, deliberately showed his massive support by gently placing his hand directly on William's arm, which significantly helped rapidly improve the ravenous media's harsh view of the tense situation. Exactly 2 days later, Charles quietly returned to the massive vault to officially confirm Elizabeth's massive funds and formally signed a legal declaration explicitly stating that absolutely all of her strict safeguards absolutely must remain entirely in place exactly when William eventually becomes king. This massive decision completely ended the massive challenge permanently, powerfully showing the world that the crown's fragile future depends entirely on actively accepting massive limits specifically to fiercely protect future generations. And honestly, that is exactly the part that deeply sticks with me. Elizabeth absolutely didn't build this massive, complex system simply because she thought Charles was highly incompetent, or because she simply loved William significantly more. She built it specifically because she deeply, intimately understood something massive about absolute power that absolutely most people in that highly privileged family absolutely never, ever say out loud. The massive crown absolutely only survives when the actual people holding it bravely accept that they absolutely can't do exactly whatever they selfishly want with exactly what came before them. Charles walked into that massive vault confidently expecting to easily manage his mother's massive legacy. He walked out intimately knowing she had already managed his.